In a quiet, bustling city in Nigeria, where the streets hummed with the sounds of motorbikes and vendors calling out their wares, a boy was quietly observing the world in a way few others could. From the outside, his life appeared ordinary: a modest home, parents working tirelessly to provide, and the usual neighborhood chaos. But behind his calm demeanor, something extraordinary was taking shape. He had an insatiable curiosity, a mind that refused to settle for the mundane, and a fascination with the invisible world of computers and networks. His parents, proud yet unaware of the depth of his obsession, often found him engrossed in broken radios, old televisions, or discarded gadgets he had collected from neighbors. He would spend hours taking them apart, studying their inner workings, and putting them back together, often with improvements of his own design. By the time he was 10, he had discovered the internet at a local cybercafe, a small, dusty room filled with humming computers and the faint smell of fried electronics. To him, it was more than a novelty. It was a universe of endless possibility. He learned fast. Within months, he had moved from simple curiosity to understanding how systems functioned, how data moved across networks, and even how software could be manipulated. He frequented online forums, some innocuous, some dark, where people exchanged tips about programming, security, and hacking techniques. He was fascinated not just by technology, but by the invisible human layer behind it, the trust people placed in machines, the blind spots in systems, and the predictable mistakes that anyone could make. At school, he was quiet, polite, and exceptionally clever. Teachers often remarked on his intelligence, praising him for his logic and problem-solving skills. But he did not confine his curiosity to the classroom. During breaks, he would sneak into the school library or the computer lab, testing the limits of school networks, learning how to bypass restrictions, and exploring accounts he was never meant to access. To anyone else, these were harmless acts of curiosity. To him, they were lessons in power and possibility. By the age of 12, he had already discovered vulnerabilities in small websites and online accounts. At first, he experimented innocently, testing logins, seeing what data he could access, but soon he realized that the digital world could be exploited. A small transfer here, a borrowed password there, each success sent a thrill through him, a rush unlike any he had known. It was the intoxicating combination of intelligence, cunning, and invisibility, the ability to affect real-world outcomes without anyone knowing who was responsible. His family never suspected a thing. They saw only a bright young man with a fascination for computers. His parents were hardworking, his mother often sewing late into the night, his father juggling odd jobs to make ends meet. They spoke to him about ethics, about honesty and hard work, never imagining that the hours he spent in front of the screen were the foundation of a criminal career that would one day span continents. Even among friends, he was an enigma. He could charm when necessary, laugh at a joke, and blend in effortlessly. Yet, when alone, he was plotting, experimenting, and learning. He discovered the early forms of phishing, how weak passwords could be exploited, and how small errors in coding could open doors to entire systems. He read endlessly, devoured forums, tutorials, and guides, absorbing information at a rate that left others behind. It wasn't just skill, it was obsession. One evening, long after his parents had gone to bed, he stumbled upon a vulnerability in an old banking website. He tested it carefully, transferring a trivial sum to a fake account he had created under a false name. The transfer went through. The confirmation screen blinked on the monitor, and he felt something he had never felt before: a sense of power, control, and invincibility. It was a small amount of money, almost meaningless to anyone else, but to him, it was the proof that he could manipulate systems that everyone else trusted implicitly. He was untouchable. This experience changed him. From that night onward, he was no longer just a curious boy. He was someone who had discovered a secret world, a hidden playground where rules were fragile and the right moves could yield enormous rewards. He began experimenting systematically, creating multiple fake identities online, testing security systems, and learning the art of deception. Every small success emboldened him. Every mistake became a lesson. He was becoming meticulous, patient, and precise, qualities that would later define his empire of crime. By the time he finished high school, his reputation in online communities had quietly begun to spread. People in obscure corners of the internet noticed his ingenuity, his skill at staying invisible while manipulating digital systems, and his fearless experimentation. Some reached out, offering him opportunities to collaborate or access more valuable data. He was just beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he could achieve. Even then, his ambition was restrained. He wasn't thinking about millions in stolen funds or US companies. He was still exploring, testing, learning. But the seed had been planted. The boy from a modest Nigerian neighborhood had glimpsed power, control, and wealth that seemed almost magical, and he was determined to see just how far he could go. Little did anyone know, this quiet, obsessive boy with a restless mind and a hunger for discovery would one day become a ghost in the digital world. A man who would steal millions from companies halfway across the globe, evade the most sophisticated law enforcement agencies for years, and eventually draw the attention of the FBI itself. At that moment, in the small confines of his room, the journey was just beginning. The tools were simple, the intentions unclear, but the path was set. The boy had discovered a world where skill, patience, and audacity could bend reality, and he was ready to bend it. By the time he was 17, the boy who once dismantled radios in his bedroom had transformed into a meticulous architect of deception. What had started as innocent curiosity and experimentation had grown into something far more dangerous: a hunger for control, a thrill from manipulation, and a growing confidence in his abilities. Every hack, every small success fuels a sense of power unlike anything he had ever experienced. His first real scam was almost accidental. One evening, while exploring online forums frequented by coders and tech enthusiasts, he noticed a small US-based company with poorly secured accounts. It was a business that dealt with digital marketing, small but reputable, and completely unaware of the vulnerabilities lurking in its systems. Most people would have ignored it, but he saw opportunity. That first discovery was like finding a door left open, an invitation to step inside. He spent days studying the company, its emails, its payment processes, and its security measures. He wasn't reckless. He knew the slightest mistake could expose him. He created a fake identity, complete with a fabricated LinkedIn profile, professional email addresses, and even falsified documents. To the company, he appeared as a legitimate vendor, someone conducting routine business. But behind the scenes, he was orchestrating his first real act of deception. The first transaction he attempted was tiny, less than $500, but its success was intoxicating. He watched the confirmation come through and felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just money changing hands. This was proof of his ability to manipulate systems, to trick people into doing exactly what he wanted, all without leaving a trace. That small amount, insignificant to most, felt like a personal triumph, a secret victory in a game only he knew existed. Encouraged, he continued experimenting. He refined his approach, learning the nuances of social engineering, the persuasive phrasing of emails, the subtle cues that would convince someone to act without questioning, the ways to exploit human trust. He studied patterns, observed how employees responded to unusual requests, and developed an uncanny ability to predict behavior. Every attempt became more ambitious than the last, every success building a sense of invincibility. By the age of 18, he had completed dozens of small-scale scams. Each one followed a similar pattern: identify vulnerability, construct a convincing persona, manipulate the target, extract value, and vanish without a trace. He kept meticulous records for himself, not in a way that would incriminate him, but to analyze patterns, improve techniques, and measure outcomes. It was a calculated process, a methodical expansion of his skill set, and he thrived in the anonymity it provided. His family remained unaware of the true nature of his activities. To them, he was a brilliant young man obsessed with technology, focused on school, and quietly ambitious. They had no idea that the hours he spent in front of his computer were spent plotting deception, testing vulnerabilities, and building the foundation for what would eventually become a multi-million-dollar cybercrime operation. The thrill of secrecy became part of his identity, a private world in which he was always the smartest person in the room. The psychological aspect of his work fascinated him almost as much as the technical side. He studied human behavior, learning how to exploit assumptions, laziness, and blind trust. People, he realized, were predictable. The right combination of authority, urgency, and subtle manipulation could make almost anyone act against their own best interest. Each successful scam reinforced this belief, and he began to view the world through a lens of opportunity that existed in systems most people considered secure. Even in these early days, he began to attract attention in online circles. Other hackers and scammers noticed his ingenuity, his ability to operate quietly and efficiently, and his success at extracting value without exposure. Some offered him collaborations, access to stolen databases, or guidance on more sophisticated techniques. He was careful in choosing whom to trust, always maintaining the upper hand, always learning, always observing. The first scam had taught him something far more valuable than money: confidence. Confidence in his intellect, his skill, and his ability to manipulate the digital world. That small act of transferring a few $100s had proven that with the right knowledge and patience, he could bend reality to his will without anyone noticing. It was a lesson that would guide him for years to come. By now, he had begun imagining bigger targets: U.S. companies with millions in revenue, institutions that most believed were secure. The thrill of the challenge beckoned, and he knew that he was ready to take his skills to the next level. The small victories of his teenage years were merely practice for the empire he intended to build. And so the journey continued. From the confines of his modest room in Nigeria, armed with nothing but a computer, ingenuity, and audacity, he set the stage for a career that would span years, cross borders, and eventually attract the attention of some of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. That first scam, seemingly insignificant, had lit the spark, a spark that would grow into a fire no firewall could contain. By the time he reached 18, the boy who had once tinkered with radios and stolen a few $100s from an unsuspecting company was no longer playing small games. His skills had matured, honed over years of experimentation, trial and error, and quiet observation. What began as curiosity and small-scale fraud had now evolved into ambition, a hunger to test the limits of his intelligence, audacity, and ability to manipulate systems far beyond his home city. He began to turn his attention to larger targets: U.S. companies that handled millions in revenue, institutions that most believed were secure, and digital infrastructures designed to prevent intrusion. For most, these systems were impenetrable, but to him, they were puzzles waiting to be solved. Each system, no matter how sophisticated, contained patterns, loopholes, and human errors. His task was simple in theory: identify the weakest link, exploit it, and vanish without leaving a trace. The first big league target he chose was a mid-sized online retailer in New York. Their website, though popular, had a glaring vulnerability: a poorly secured vendor payment portal that allowed for verification bypass under specific conditions. It took weeks to study, but he watched, analyzed, and learned. Every transaction, every email exchange, every staff workflow became data for him. He wasn't reckless. Patience was his greatest weapon. Unlike many who acted impulsively and were caught, he planned meticulously, testing every angle before making a move. When he finally executed the scam, he didn't just steal a few $100s. He siphoned thousands at a time, moving the money through layers of fake accounts and digital shells to ensure it could not be traced back to him. The rush was unlike anything he had felt before. Each successful transaction validated his skills. Each untraceable transfer reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. And yet, with each success, he grew more daring, more confident, and more audacious. This was also the stage where he began perfecting his digital disguise. He created multiple online personas, each with a fabricated identity, complete with professional-looking emails, fake businesses, and even subtle online footprints to make them seem real. To anyone investigating, these accounts were legitimate, but behind the screen, he was orchestrating complex fraud schemes that spanned multiple states and industries. It was a digital web, invisible to the human eye, yet perfectly organized. The psychological thrill was as powerful as the financial reward. He watched employees click links he sent, approve transactions he manipulated, and follow instructions from personas he had created, all without realizing they were being duped. It was a game of patience, observation, and timing. He learned to anticipate reactions, exploit human error, and craft messages that triggered action without suspicion. Over time, he developed a near-perfect understanding of human behavior, combined with technological mastery, a combination that made him extremely dangerous. Word of his activities began to spread, quietly, in the underworld of cybercrime forums. Other hackers and scammers, impressed by his audacity and skill, sought him out for advice and collaboration. Some offered access to more valuable databases, others suggested targets of increasing scale. He was careful whom he trusted. Alliances were temporary, and betrayal could be fatal. Over the next few months, he orchestrated dozens of high-value scams, each one more sophisticated than the last, each one leaving his victims unaware and law enforcement frustrated. Despite his growing success, he maintained a facade of normalcy in his daily life. His parents still saw only a brilliant young man obsessed with computers. Friends continued to treat him as the quiet, clever kid who excelled at schoolwork. In reality, he spent long nights coordinating scams, testing vulnerabilities, and refining techniques that would later make him infamous. He became a ghost in the digital world, invisible yet omnipresent, untouchable yet devastating in his impact. His early victories emboldened him to expand his reach. He began targeting companies in sectors traditionally considered secure: finance, tech, and logistics. Each new target taught him something new: how to bypass firewalls, how to manipulate employees into divulging confidential information, and how to cover his tracks with digital precision. With each success, he refined his methods, building a playbook that he would follow for years to come. But as he ascended into the big leagues, he also began to attract attention, though he was still unaware of it. Small anomalies in financial reports, unusual transfers, and unexplained discrepancies began to surface. Companies started noticing irregularities, though few could pinpoint the source. Law enforcement agencies were alerted in isolated incidents, but his careful methods left no clear leads. To him, this was all part of the thrill, a silent challenge to remain one step ahead of authorities who were barely aware of his existence. This was the turning point where his life shifted from a quiet, invisible game of experimentation to the high-stakes world of organized cyber fraud. He had tasted the thrill of real money, the power of influence, and the intoxicating control that came with manipulating digital systems on a large scale. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The US was vast, filled with opportunities, and most importantly, his skill set gave him the ability to operate across borders, unseen and undetected. By the end of this phase, he had established himself as a formidable force in the world of cybercrime, a genius in digital deception, a manipulator of human behavior, and an operator who had moved beyond petty scams into the realm of serious, high-stakes fraud. And yet, for all his brilliance, he had no idea that one small mistake, one tiny misstep, would one day bring this empire crashing down. From his modest room in Nigeria, surrounded by computers, cables, and the quiet hum of servers he had built himself, he looked out into the digital world with confidence. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Success changed him, but not in the way most people imagine. It didn't make him reckless, it made him methodical. Every successful operation confirmed one thing: the system wasn't as secure as people believed, and he understood it better than those paid to protect it. What he was building now wasn't a series of scams, it was an infrastructure, a digital empire designed to operate quietly, efficiently, and indefinitely. He reorganized everything. Gone were the single-use email accounts and improvised setups. In their place came layers, multiple laptops, isolated systems, encrypted communications, and virtual environments that never touched his personal life. Each operation was compartmentalized. If one identity burned, it wouldn't expose the others. If one account was flagged, it led nowhere. This was no longer experimentation. This was structure. He created entire fake companies, shell businesses with convincing websites, phone numbers, fabricated employee profiles, and years of artificial online history. Some posed as logistics firms, others as tech vendors or financial consultants. Each had its own role in the ecosystem he was constructing. To investigators, they looked like real businesses operating across borders. To him, they were tools. Money flowed through carefully designed channels. He avoided large, suspicious transfers. Instead, he moved funds in patterns that mimicked legitimate business activity: invoice payments, service fees, contract settlements. The amounts were large enough to matter, but not large enough to trigger immediate alarms. And when alarms did ring, they rang too late. He learned to exploit something far more dangerous than weak firewalls: human routine. Employees trusted patterns. If payments happened every month, they stopped questioning them. If emails looked familiar, they stopped scrutinizing them. He inserted himself into workflows so smoothly that his presence felt normal. By the time companies realized something was wrong, they couldn't pinpoint when it started or how long it had been happening. His nights became longer. Sleep was optional. He monitored time zones, aligning his activity with U.S. business hours while the city around him slept. While neighbors rested, he worked silently, jumping between systems, identities, and targets. The glow of multiple screens lit his room as transactions executed thousands of miles away. Money began to pile up. Not recklessly, not flamboyantly, but steadily. He diversified. Some funds were converted to assets, others disappeared into digital shadows. He understood that wealth alone could expose him, so he lived carefully. No flashy displays, no sudden lifestyle changes. He blended in, always. Online, however, his reputation grew. In private forums and encrypted chat groups, his name, never his real one, carried weight. Others spoke of his precision, his patience, his ability to operate without noise. Newcomers sought his advice. Veterans offered partnerships. He accepted some, rejected most. Trust was currency, and he spent it sparingly. With collaboration came scale. He now had access to stolen credentials in bulk, corporate email compromises, insider data, entire vendor networks. Each new resource expanded his reach. His operations crossed industries: retail, logistics, healthcare, tech. And with every expansion, he refined his methods, improving efficiency, minimizing risk. What made him dangerous wasn't just technical skill, it was discipline. He never rushed, he never panicked. When something felt off, he paused operations entirely. Days, weeks, sometimes months. Most criminals couldn't do that. They needed constant action. He didn't. He could wait. That patience saved him more times than he knew. Behind the scenes, damage was spreading. U.S. companies noticed missing funds, discrepancies that didn't align with internal theft or accounting errors. Some quietly absorbed the losses. Others reported incidents without urgency, assuming they were isolated. They weren't. They were pieces of something larger, but no one saw the full picture yet. And he knew that. He understood how investigations worked, how long patterns took to emerge, how overwhelmed departments were, how easy it was for separate incidents to remain unconnected. That knowledge gave him confidence, measured, controlled confidence. He was careful not to celebrate. Instead, he expanded his safety net. Backups of backups, emergency exit plans, identities prepared to vanish if needed. He rehearsed worst-case scenarios in his head, playing them over and over. Arrests, seizures, mistakes. every outcome mapped, every response planned. But with time, something subtle changed. The empire worked too well. Months passed without close calls, years without consequences. His systems ran smoothly, almost automatically. Success became routine, and routine bred comfort. Comfort, even for the most disciplined mind, can be dangerous. He began trusting his process more than his instincts. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, patterns were forming, slowly. Losses that seemed unrelated began to resemble each other. Similar invoice fraud, similar digital footprints, similar behaviors. Nothing obvious, nothing conclusive, but enough to raise quiet questions in the right places. He didn't see it yet. From his perspective, the empire was flawless. Money flowed, targets fell, no knocks at the door, no warnings on the screen, just the steady hum of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. For years, he had built something that appeared untouchable. And that illusion, more than greed, more than ambition, was what would eventually betray him. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come as a warning. There was no dramatic email, no flashing alert, no knock at the door. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, buried inside routine. One of his shell companies, a logistics vendor he had used for months, experienced a delay. Not a shutdown, not a freeze, just a delay. A scheduled payment that normally cleared within hours lingered for days. To most people, it would have been nothing. To him, it was noise in a system that was supposed to be silent. He paused everything. No new transactions, no emails, no logins. He watched from a distance, studying the delay like a physician monitoring an irregular heartbeat. His instincts told him not to panic, but also not to proceed. That balance had kept him alive in the digital world for years. Behind the scenes, the company had noticed inconsistencies, nothing dramatic. A junior accountant flagged an invoice that didn't fully align with previous records. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, it wasn't even enough to escalate immediately, but it was enough to trigger an internal review. That was how close it was. Internal reviews were dangerous not because they were effective, but because they were unpredictable. They brought fresh eyes into systems that criminals relied on becoming invisible. And fresh eyes asked uncomfortable questions. He sensed it before he knew it. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. He reviewed every step of the operation, every email header, every login time, every routing path. He looked for anomalies, for anything that could be traced back to him. He found nothing, and that disturbed him even more. When everything looks clean, it's hard to know where danger is hiding. Days passed. Then came the email. It was polite, professional, routine. A request for clarification on a previous invoice. That was it.
To an outsider, it meant nothing. To him, it meant everything. This was how investigations began, not with accusations, but with conversation, with engagement, with bait. He didn't respond. Silence was sometimes safer than explanation. Responding created dialogue. Dialogue created records. Records created patterns. Instead, he watched. Inside the company, the inquiry stalled. No follow-up, no escalation. The junior accountant was reassigned. The concern dissolved into background noise. Whatever suspicion existed never reached the level of urgency. The system had protected itself, not by design, but by apathy. He exhaled, slowly. But the incident changed him. For the first time, he acknowledged something he had avoided thinking about. He wasn't invisible because he was perfect. He was invisible because no one had looked closely enough, yet. That realization forced adjustments. He retired several identities immediately. Entire shell companies vanished overnight. Websites went offline. Email servers were wiped. He absorbed the losses without hesitation. Money could be replaced. Exposure could not. He tightened operational windows, reduced frequency, increased randomness. Where patterns once existed, he injected chaos.
He stopped using familiar phrasing, changed time habits, altered routing paths. To anyone watching, it would look like noise. To him, it was survival. Yet, despite the scare, something else happened. Something quieter, more dangerous. Confidence returned. Not arrogance, not yet, but reassurance. He had faced scrutiny and slipped through. A real company had looked directly at one of his operations and found nothing solid enough to pursue. That reinforced a belief he had held for years, that he understood the system better than those inside it. He resumed operations, carefully, methodically, with renewed discipline, and business continued. Months passed, then another year. No follow-ups, no escalations, no subpoenas, no frozen accounts. The close call faded into memory, filed away as a lesson learned. But lessons, when not reinforced by consequences, can dull. Gradually, he began re-expanding. New vendors, new companies, new layers. The empire adjusted, adapted, and grew stronger. From the outside, it looked seamless. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the delay had left behind something small, not evidence, a record. A digital note buried in internal systems, an anomaly logged, unresolved but not erased. Not enough to act on, not enough to investigate, but enough to exist. Years later, that single unresolved anomaly would resurface, not as proof, but as a thread. And when pulled by the right hands, it would connect things that were never meant to be connected. For now, though, the city around him remained unaware. Life continued. His neighbors slept, his family went about their routines, and in his room, screens glowed quietly as money moved invisibly across borders. He had survived his first brush with exposure, and survival, in his world, was confirmation. The game continued. By the time he was in his early 20s, the boy from a modest Nigerian neighborhood had transformed into a man living in quiet luxury. The stolen funds had accumulated steadily over years of meticulous planning, precise execution, and careful evasion. He was no longer just a hacker working behind a screen. He was a man whose empire had tangible results, wealth, status, and freedom that few around him could even imagine. He didn't flaunt it, at least not initially. The early lessons of discretion were ingrained too deeply. Flashy purchases or public displays of wealth were dangerous, and he had learned that early. Instead, he created a life that signaled success subtly. A new car, yes, but nothing ostentatious. Expensive gadgets and computers, tools of his trade, but presented as necessary work equipment. The house he rented in an upscale area was modest on the outside, but filled with technology and private rooms for his operations. Every detail was calculated. But the lifestyle itself was intoxicating. He began traveling more, visiting other cities, sometimes outside Nigeria, using his fake identities. Hotels booked under shell companies, flights under anonymous accounts. To the outside world, it seemed like business. To him, it was freedom. He could move anywhere, anytime, without anyone tracing him. And with that freedom came a psychological thrill he had never experienced before. He was untouchable. Luxury, however, was not just about material wealth. It was about power. The quiet, almost invisible power that came from knowing he could affect events thousands of miles away, manipulate outcomes, and remain unseen. He was a ghost in the financial world, and that ghost lived well. He invested carefully, not in ways that would draw attention, no sudden real estate splurges or ostentatious cars, but in assets that would retain value quietly. Digital accounts, cryptocurrency exchanges, offshore investments. Money flowed through channels he controlled completely. Every layer had a purpose: security, efficiency, or camouflage. The empire was growing, but it remained invisible to anyone looking for it. With wealth came indulgences, subtle but satisfying. Fine clothes, dinners at discreet restaurants, gadgets that made life easier and more comfortable. He began to cultivate an image of success within his circles, friends, acquaintances, and some online collaborators, but always controlled, always careful not to reveal the source of his wealth. Every action was a performance, designed to blend wealth with legitimacy. At this stage, he was no longer working alone. He had collaborators, other hackers, occasional insiders in certain companies, people who could provide data or help move money discreetly. Communication was always encrypted, always indirect. He built a network that was both functional and compartmentalized. If one connection was exposed, the others would remain untouched. It was an empire of shadows, each piece operating independently, yet under his ultimate control. Despite the growing complexity, he maintained strict routines. His life was organized, almost ritualistic. Certain hours for monitoring targets, certain hours for personal time, others for planning. Sleep was still secondary, but he had learned to manage fatigue efficiently. Nothing could compromise the system and nothing could expose him. Not yet. Yet luxury, for all its comfort, introduced risks he hadn't fully considered. The more resources he had, the more tempting small mistakes became. A new gadget shipped to a home address, a payment for a luxury item using a traceable route, a casual brag to a collaborator in an encrypted chat. Each carried potential consequences. He understood the risks intellectually, but confidence in his skill had begun to edge into complacency. He also began testing social dynamics on a new level. Employees in companies, security teams, even other hackers. He studied how humans reacted when confronted with authority or the illusion of legitimacy. Emails were no longer just transactions, they were psychological tools. He learned to phrase requests in ways that invoked trust, urgency, or fear of missing out. Each interaction was a small game, one in which he always had the advantage. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, subtle patterns continued to emerge. Multiple U.S. companies were experiencing irregular transfers, invoice discrepancies, and unauthorized account access. Individually, these incidents appeared isolated, but slowly faint threads began to form. It was nothing that could be acted upon yet, but the seeds of eventual exposure were quietly taking root. He remained unaware. In his world, nothing could touch him. He moved with precision, his empire humming quietly, money flowing as predicted, systems functioning flawlessly. The luxury he enjoyed was not just material, it was psychological. Each successful transfer, each unchallenged operation reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. Yet, as with all empires built in shadows, there was one undeniable truth: nothing lasts forever. Every system, no matter how perfect, contains imperfection. Every human, no matter how disciplined, can make a mistake, and every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, can be traced, if someone knows where to look. For now, however, he remained free, and in that freedom, he thrived. Thousands of miles away in an office buzzing with fluorescent light and the low hum of computers, a small team of FBI analysts began noticing patterns. At first, they were subtle, isolated incidents that seemed disconnected, an unusual transfer here, a strange invoice there. At a glance, each case appeared mundane, nothing more than an administrative error or a minor internal mismanagement, but trained eyes saw the anomalies. The FBI had systems designed to detect financial irregularities across multiple companies. It wasn't their primary function, but they flagged issues that might indicate organized criminal activity. In this case, the anomalies were consistent in certain sectors, small to mid-sized companies in tech, logistics, and digital services. All were based in the United States. All had minor, unexplained discrepancies in payments or accounts. Individually, none was alarming. Together, they hinted at something far more deliberate. One of the analysts, a meticulous woman with years of experience in fraud detection, noticed a peculiar similarity. Invoices from different companies, different industries, different states, shared patterns in formatting, timing, and routing. The transactions themselves were legitimate in appearance, but subtle enough to mask illicit activity. It was almost invisible to the untrained eye, but to her it was like spotting a faint fingerprint on glass, hard to see but unmistakable once noticed. The team began connecting the dots. They created a timeline, noting when transfers occurred, which accounts were used, and the small anomalies in documentation. Each connection was tentative, requiring further verification. They contacted the companies asking for clarification on transactions, employee access logs, and internal security protocols. Most of the time, the companies responded slowly, dismissing incidents as minor errors. But the pattern persisted. The analysts ran simulations, looking for links between the seemingly unrelated companies. They examined IP addresses, email headers, transaction routes, and employee behaviors. It was painstaking work and the scope was enormous, but gradually faint traces emerged. They weren't concrete leads, not yet, but they were enough to suggest an orchestrated campaign of cyber fraud, one that spanned multiple states, industries, and companies. Meanwhile, the criminal in Nigeria remained oblivious. He continued operations as usual, confident in the security of his systems and the sophistication of his methods. He monitored U.S. business hours from his room, executed transactions, and refined his tactics. The FBI, for now, was just a distant, unnoticed presence, a faint ripple in a vast ocean that he believed he controlled. It was the kind of cat-and-mouse game that required patience. Investigators needed months, sometimes years, to gather sufficient evidence before taking action. They could not move hastily. A single misstep could alert the criminal, and in cyberspace, that could mean he vanished without a trace. And yet, despite the slowness, progress was being made. Analysts began noticing commonalities in the tools used, the structure of fake email accounts, the timing of invoice submissions, and the subtle patterns in routing payments. Each anomaly, each faint similarity was cataloged meticulously. Though the criminal had designed his empire to be compartmentalized and invisible, the traces were there, quiet, almost imperceptible, but persistent. In one case, a particularly detailed investigation revealed a sequence of transfers that defied typical corporate behavior. Payments appeared at odd times, accounts were accessed from unusual locations, and email communications contained patterns that matched across companies. The team flagged this as a priority, escalating the case to the cybercrime division. For the analysts, it was a puzzle. They didn't know yet who was behind it, nor did they know the full scale, but the fingerprints were consistent enough to suggest a single orchestrator, a skilled actor operating from a remote location, exploiting the blind spots in corporate processes. Back in Nigeria, the hacker noticed nothing unusual. His empire functioned flawlessly. His collaborators executed tasks without error. Transactions moved as planned. And yet, in the digital shadow, a quiet tension was building, a tension he could neither see nor anticipate. The FBI began preparing for long-term surveillance. They mapped potential suspects, cross-referenced online activity, and consulted with private cybersecurity experts. Each step required extreme discretion. Any hint of exposure could send the criminal underground, forcing investigators to start over. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Slowly, the faint threads of evidence began to form a map. The agencies could not yet identify him, but they had enough to understand that they were dealing with a highly skilled individual, someone who is not just opportunistic, but strategic, methodical, and disciplined. The team gave him a code name, Phantom. Invisible, untouchable, yet causing real-world consequences in the millions of dollars. Companies were losing funds, employees were being manipulated, and for the first time, the FBI knew that the case was not just isolated incidents, it was a coordinated cybercrime empire. And somewhere in Nigeria, the architect of it all continued to live, work, and plan, unaware that the first faint tendrils of investigation had already reached him, though he could not feel them yet. He would remain free, untouched, and free for now. But as with all empires built in deception, one day, one misstep would make all of this visible. And when that day came, the FBI's attention would shift from tracing anomalies to tracking a single individual, and no shadow in cyberspace could hide forever. By now, the hacker had entered a new phase. No longer a teenager experimenting with small amounts or testing vulnerabilities, he was executing carefully orchestrated operations that spanned months. His empire had matured, each shell company, identity, and account functioning like a clockwork mechanism. Every email, every invoice, every transfer was a calculated move in a grand game few could even imagine. He called it the long con. The long con wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic heists, no sudden high-risk moves. Instead, it relied on consistency, patience, and invisibility. He would infiltrate a company, manipulate a minor aspect of its workflow, and wait. Days, weeks, sometimes months. He would observe patterns, identify weaknesses, and exploit them subtly. By the time anyone noticed discrepancies, the damage was already done and he had vanished quietly into the digital shadows. This approach made him almost untouchable. Most fraud investigations focused on immediate anomalies, big transfers, sudden changes, or obvious errors, but he operated below the radar, creating tiny repeated transfers that accumulated into millions over time. Each small gain was insignificant individually, but devastating in total. It was the perfect combination of scale and stealth. During this period, he began targeting multiple companies simultaneously, carefully segregating each operation. One team of fake employees managed invoicing for a tech firm. Another company handled logistics for a retail chain. A third provided consulting services. Each was isolated, compartmentalized, and backed by its own digital infrastructure. If one operation was questioned, it would not compromise the others. His digital habits became rituals. He worked late at night, synchronizing his activity with U.S. business hours, ensuring emails and transfers appeared legitimate. He used encrypted communication channels, virtual private networks, and constantly rotated IP addresses to obscure his location. Every login, every email, every transaction was a move in a long, carefully rehearsed chess game. The long con also required psychological insight. Employees, executives, and accountants were all human. He studied their habits, tendencies, and blind spots. Simple things like phrasing an email with authority, timing a request during peak workloads, or exploiting trust in familiar formats became his tools. He understood human behavior as well as he understood firewalls. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation quietly intensified. Analysts had begun correlating incidents across multiple states and industries. They noticed patterns in the transactions, email structures, and timing, all subtle, all faint, but increasingly consistent. They hadn't found him yet, but the traces were accumulating, and for a highly skilled operator like him, even the smallest trace could one day become fatal. Despite the growing sophistication of the FBI's efforts, he remained confident. Years of experience had taught him patience, discipline, and the art of invisibility. Each operation was tested multiple times. Backup accounts, alternative pathways, and contingency plans were always in place. Mistakes, he believed, were for amateurs. Yet, even the most disciplined operators are human. Small oversights began creeping in, not immediately, but subtly. A login from an IP address that hadn't been rotated properly. An invoice format reused from a previous operation, a collaborator who wasn't as careful as him. Each was minor in isolation, invisible in the grand scheme, but the long con relies on maintaining absolute control, and even minor deviations can unravel years of planning. This period also marked his growing boldness. He began experimenting with larger targets, attempting transfers that were more ambitious than anything he had done before. The thrill of executing a major operation combined with the skill he had developed over years emboldened him. He had survived close calls, evaded detection, and grown increasingly confident in his empire. And yet, in the background, the FBI's web slowly tightened. Analysts traced patterns, flagged irregularities, and began building connections between operations that seemed unrelated at first. Every small trace he left, no matter how insignificant it seemed at the time, became a piece of the puzzle. They were following the digital breadcrumbs he thought were invisible. The long con for him was a game of skill. For the FBI, it was a slow revelation. Each month, each small anomaly added context. Each invoice, each routing irregularity added detail to a growing map. And while he worked confidently from Nigeria, they were preparing the framework for what would become one of the most complex investigations into cyber fraud in years. The brilliance of his long con was that no one ever suspected the scale. To most, he was invisible. Losses appeared as minor errors, human mistakes, or internal fraud. Companies never imagined a single individual orchestrating such widespread deception. And that invisibility gave him power, years of unchallenged operations, untold millions transferred, and complete dominance in a world few understood. But as with all long cons, success carried risk. The longer he played, the more exposure he accumulated. Every repeated operation, every subtle pattern added data to the digital trail he had created. And one day, that trail would be followed. One day, that carefully built empire, executed flawlessly for years, would come under the scrutiny of experts capable of seeing what he thought was invisible. Until then, he continued. The screens glowed, payments processed, emails sent, and digital doors opened and closed under his control. Every move reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. Every night, the city around him slept, unaware that a man half a world away was running an empire of invisible transactions, quietly siphoning millions and leaving trails only experts could one day follow. The long con was working perfectly. For now. No empire, no matter how carefully built, is immune to human error. And for the Nigerian hacker, it was a single, seemingly insignificant mistake that would eventually unravel years of near-perfect operations. It happened late one night during a routine operation. He was processing a series of transfers between multiple shell companies, each meticulously planned to avoid detection. The sequence was familiar, practiced countless times before, and yet, in the monotony of repetition, a tiny oversight occurred. An email header from one of his shell accounts, a minor inconspicuous detail, was misconfigured. A technical anomaly, invisible to most, but detectable by someone trained to notice patterns. In that single header, the digital fingerprint of Phantom left a subtle trace. At first, it was meaningless. He didn't notice. The funds moved, everything appeared normal. The collaborator handling the follow-up emails noticed nothing unusual. It was, in every way, a perfect operation on the surface. But unknown to him, the FBI analysts who had been quietly mapping his activities caught the faint anomaly and logged it. Meanwhile, his confidence was absolute. Years of evading detection, months of flawless execution, and the wealth and luxury he now enjoyed reinforced a dangerous belief. He was untouchable. Mistakes in his mind belonged to amateurs. He worked late into the night, screens glowing, code executing, transactions processed, all while the first thread of his unraveling was quietly forming in another continent. The next morning, he continued operations as usual, but the FBI analysts began cross-referencing the anomaly with previous incidents. It was a subtle alignment, not immediately conclusive, but enough to create a pattern. They noticed similarities in the timing of transfers, email structures, and routing details. Nothing screamed, "Phantom is here," but the pieces began to fit together like a faint outline of a puzzle. That single mistake, imperceptible to him, became the seed of a chain reaction. It wasn't catastrophic in isolation, but in the world of cyber investigations, anomalies accumulate. The more data analysts gather, the easier it becomes to reconstruct behavior. And Phantom, confident and meticulous, had left just enough. For the hacker, life continued as normal. He didn't feel the subtle shift, the quiet tightening of a net that had been years in the making. He traveled lightly, worked tirelessly, and expanded operations to additional companies. His wealth allowed him to indulge in small luxuries, a new car, upgraded equipment, private servers, and occasional travel. Every indulgence seemed harmless, part of a life earned by skill and intelligence. But even these moves created digital traces, tiny inconsistencies, timestamps, or network log entries that combined with the first anomaly added depth to the FBI's growing map. The long con continued flawlessly in appearance. Emails were sent, transfers processed, fake identities maintained. Each day reinforced his belief in his invincibility. And yet, in the background, the first thread was already being pulled. Analysts noticed patterns emerging across different targets. Invoice formats, transaction timings, and routing coincidences were subtle but consistent. Forensic experts began connecting anomalies, comparing them with previously unrelated incidents. Slowly, the disparate points of data formed a faint web that hinted at a single orchestrator. In cybercrime investigations, patterns are everything. They tell stories that no single data point can, and Phantom's first mistake, almost invisible at the time, provided just enough of a thread for investigators to follow. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the hacker remained unaware. He had built systems to avoid exposure. He had created redundancies, rotated IP addresses, and encrypted communications. Everything that had kept him invisible for years was still in place, but it couldn't erase a subtle trace in a digital ecosystem observed by highly skilled analysts. His collaborators continued to execute orders flawlessly. Shell companies operated without error. Millions of dollars moved across accounts, leaving no immediate sign of intrusion. To any outside observer, or even most law enforcement, the empire was still perfect. But perfection is a fragile illusion. It only takes one thread, one anomaly, to unravel a carefully woven web, and Phantom had left that thread. As weeks passed, analysts began layering anomalies, identifying connections that had previously been invisible. What started as a minor irregularity in an email header began to illuminate patterns across multiple operations. They didn't yet know the identity of the hacker or even his location, but they had something far more valuable: consistency, a traceable behavior that could not be ignored. In the hacker's mind, there was no error. He reviewed logs, transactions, and communications as usual. Everything aligned. The empire functioned as planned. Confidence remained high, bordering on arrogance. But in reality, the first crack had formed. Small, but inevitable. And it was enough to begin the slow process of exposure. No alarms, no dramatic alerts, just a quiet observation on the other side of the Atlantic. A team of analysts noting anomalies, tracing patterns, and slowly connecting dots. The first mistake, invisible to him, had already begun to speak louder than any transfer, email, or shell company ever could. The long con had survived for years, but it would not survive forever. The first mistake, invisible and trivial to him, had now begun its quiet work. On the other side of the Atlantic, the FBI's cybercrime team was piecing together anomalies, one data point at a time. Every email header, every routing irregularity, every subtle coincidence in timing and transaction structure was cataloged, analyzed, and cross-referenced. By now, they had a name, or rather a code name: Phantom. To the analysts, he was a ghost, operating with precision, patience, and ruthlessness. They didn't know his identity, they didn't know his location, but the pattern was unmistakable. A single orchestrator orchestrating millions of dollars of fraud, quietly from somewhere in the world. The breakthrough began with a trace, faint, almost imperceptible. One of the minor anomalies, a misconfigured email header from months prior, had a small piece of data overlooked by anyone else. The header revealed a routing path leading through a series of intermediate servers. At first glance, it was meaningless, but with meticulous forensic work, the team traced it further, layer by layer, analyzing timestamps, IP rotations, and connection points. It was like unwrapping a set of Russian dolls. Each server led to another. Each relay appeared innocent. Each bounce obscured the location, but not perfectly. The network, no matter how sophisticated, always leaves traces, and Phantom had unknowingly left just enough. Forensic analysts began mapping the trail geographically. Coordinates were rough, indirect, but a pattern emerged pointing to Nigeria. Not a city at first, not a street, just a country, a vast target for a global investigation, but a starting point. The discovery sent ripples through the team. Suddenly, the game changed. What had been a series of isolated anomalies became a potential target for real-world intervention. If Phantom could be identified and located physically, law enforcement could act directly, not just trace transactions or block accounts, but arrest the individual behind the empire. But Nigeria posed challenges. Legal protocols, jurisdictional limits, and local cooperation were obstacles. The FBI could track and observe, but they could not act without collaboration from Nigerian authorities. This required patience, diplomacy, and careful planning. Any misstep could send Phantom underground, disappearing into the digital ether and leaving investigators with nothing. Meanwhile, Phantom continued operations as usual. He had no reason to suspect he had been traced. Millions moved, shell companies operated, emails were sent, all seemingly flawless. Confidence was absolute. He had built his empire to be invisible. He had contingency plans, redundant accounts, and multiple layers of disguise. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Back in the FBI office, analysts began compiling evidence, creating a profile based on behavior, timing, and operational style. They didn't know his identity yet, but they could begin to understand his habits. Long hours of night activity suggested a time zone in Africa. The precision of operations suggested training and education. The digital sophistication suggested someone who had spent years mastering both technology and human behavior. As the pieces aligned, the team began to narrow the search. Analysts mapped potential cities, compared routing patterns with ISP data, and cross-referenced available public information. Each new layer brought them closer, turning the abstract idea of Phantom into a traceable target. And then, finally, a breakthrough. One of the digital breadcrumbs, a reused IP segment from an old operation, coincided with a service provider in a Nigerian city. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a home address, but it was a location to focus on. Surveillance could begin. Analysts now had a geographic anchor, and suddenly, the invisible shadow had a place in the real world. For the FBI, the tension was palpable. Months of work had led to this point. Every subsequent step required precision. They had to maintain secrecy, ensure digital activity wasn't interrupted, and coordinate with local authorities without alerting Phantom. One false move, one exposed investigation, and he could vanish forever. For Phantom, life remained blissfully normal. Computers hummed, transactions executed, collaborators carried out instructions. Every day, his empire functioned flawlessly. He believed in the perfection of his design. He had no awareness that halfway across the world, a group of people had begun connecting him to a physical location, that each digital trace was being mapped, and the empire he thought untouchable had already left clues leading directly to him. The irony was stark. Years of meticulous planning, precision, and invisibility had all come down to a single minor mistake, a misconfigured email header, unnoticed at the time. That one error had left a thread, and the FBI had pulled it. As the investigation progressed, analysts continued layering data, comparing timestamps, transaction patterns, and even behavior quirks that suggested habits, routines, and likely locations. From these, the field team began constructing a profile, not just of Phantom's digital footprint, but of the man behind it. Unbeknownst to him, Phantom's first misstep had set in motion a chain reaction. Every operation since that error, every email, every transfer, and every login became traceable, if only by someone who knew what to look for, and the FBI knew. What had once been an abstract figure, a ghost, a digital enigma, was slowly becoming a real target. A man in Nigeria, living in quiet luxury, running a global fraud empire, was now the subject of one of the most sophisticated cyber investigations in history. And yet, in his room, Phantom remained confident. Screens glowed, servers hummed, money moved. He had no reason to suspect that the first tiny error, an email header misconfiguration, would one day lead investigators to the very city, the very neighborhood, and eventually the very door where he lived. The shadow had been traced, and the hunt finally had a direction. The moment Phantom's location was narrowed to Nigeria, the FBI shifted from observation to strategic pursuit. Months of careful tracing had led them from vague anomalies to a city, a network of IPs, and potential service providers. Each digital breadcrumb now became a tangible thread in the real world, and the team knew that the next steps required both precision and patience. They could not act recklessly. Unlike domestic investigations, cross-border operations introduced layers of legal and logistical challenges. Nigerian authorities had their own protocols, and any miscommunication could alert Phantom or force him to disappear before they could act. Every move had to be calculated. The team expanded, pulling in cybersecurity experts, financial analysts, and field operatives. The analysts shared every piece of evidence: email structures, transaction patterns, login times, and even minute behavioral quirks that suggested habits, routines, and likely locations. From these, the field team began constructing a profile, not just of Phantom's digital footprint, but of the man behind it. From Nigeria, Phantom continued operations as usual. His long con had evolved into an empire, with dozens of shell companies, multiple collaborators, and hundreds of transactions flowing seamlessly across borders. He believed his systems were flawless. Confidence had been his greatest ally for years, and he leaned on it now, oblivious to the tightening noose. Yet, even as he worked, subtle signals began to appear, signals that most would never notice, but which the FBI was trained to exploit. Service requests, login timings, minor configuration errors, even habits in the way he formatted emails. These were not mistakes in the traditional sense, but small patterns that, when layered over years, formed a recognizable signature. Phantom had unknowingly embedded a personal mark into his empire. The FBI began network surveillance in Nigeria, working with local agencies to map potential addresses linked to the digital traces. They identified internet service providers used in the past, narrowed accounts with suspicious activity, and cross-referenced transaction routes. Analysts built models predicting likely locations based on timing, patterns, and connectivity. Every calculation, every prediction brought them closer. Meanwhile, Phantom, in his room surrounded by screens and servers, felt untouchable. He had lived this way for years, working late into the night, monitoring U.S. business hours, coordinating transactions, and staying 3 steps ahead of every system and authority he had encountered. He believed his precautions were sufficient. He believed he had accounted for everything. But the FBI's methods were different. They were patient, methodical, and global. They were not chasing him based on single incidents. They were building a composite of years of activity, analyzing patterns invisible to the casual observer. And now, the patterns were converging. The first breakthrough came from cross-referencing financial activity. Accounts linked to shell companies in the US were traced to intermediary accounts in Europe, then further routed through Nigerian banks. Even with the careful obfuscation, the financial signature of Phantom's operations left subtle traces. A transaction timestamp here, a formatting pattern there, a minor routing anomaly. Each piece became a thread connecting him to the digital footprint the FBI had been tracking for years. Analysts began overlaying digital activity with probable geographic locations using algorithms to estimate where logins occurred relative to time zones and connection speeds. Forensic experts in cyber operations worked tirelessly, reconstructing sequences of operations that had taken place over months, even years. Slowly, a picture emerged, not just of his operations, but of the man orchestrating them. With each connection, the net tightened. Field teams prepared for surveillance, anticipating movement patterns, studying local infrastructure, and assessing the risks of approaching a target whose skill in digital operations had evaded authorities for so long. They did not yet know exactly who he was or where he lived, but they were closing in with precision. For Phantom, life remained routine. Servers hummed, transactions executed, collaborators performed flawlessly, and the empire thrived. Confidence had been his constant companion for years, and it remained unshakable. Every day of flawless operation reinforced the illusion of invincibility. But the FBI was methodical. Patience was their most valuable tool. They knew that rushing the operation could alert him and allow him to disappear into the digital ether. After months of painstaking work, the FBI finally caught their first significant lead. The traces they had been following for years, patterns of emails, routing anomalies, and financial transfers, had converged into something tangible. For the first time, they had more than a city or a vague geographic region. They had a specific clue that could point directly to the man known only as Phantom. It started with an old email. One of Phantom's shell accounts, used months ago, had been misconfigured, just enough to leave a piece of metadata behind. This metadata was almost meaningless on its own. A timestamp, a minor routing header, a fragment of a network path. But combined with the wealth of other data the analysts had collected, it began to reveal patterns of behavior and probable locations. The breakthrough came when investigators cross-referenced this email data with transactions processed through intermediary accounts in Europe. The money trail, previously abstract and diffuse, now had a faint anchor point in Nigeria. More importantly, the pattern suggested that the same individual had consistently operated from a specific region within the city, as if tied to a daily routine. This was the first time a phantom's invisible world intersected with reality. Analysts began focusing on potential service providers in the region. Internet accounts, previously anonymous or obfuscated, were matched against partial identifiers left by Phantom. Each alignment strengthened the case, narrowing the circle. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but each digital breadcrumb reduced the haystack's size. They had no name, they had no photograph, but they had behavioral fingerprints. The pattern of work, late nights synchronized with US business hours, specific timing and transfers, and the way emails were composed formed a profile. Experts could now predict likely times of online activity, probable locations within the city, and even possible methods of communication. It was not enough to make an arrest yet, but it was enough to plan surveillance. Meanwhile, Phantom continued living his life as though nothing had changed. Servers hummed, transactions executed, collaborators performed flawlessly, and the empire thrived. Confidence had been his constant companion for years, and it remained unshakable. Every day of flawless operation reinforced the illusion of invincibility. But the FBI was methodical. Patience was their most valuable tool. They knew that rushing the operation could alert him and allow him to disappear into the digital ether. Instead, they began discreetly gathering intelligence on the local environment, mapping likely neighborhoods, possible residences, and even patterns of daily activity. Every piece of information would contribute to building a comprehensive picture of Phantom's world beyond the screen. The first lead also revealed something unexpected, subtle mistakes in his digital routines. Not glaring errors, not immediate exposure, but minor inconsistencies repeated over time. Perhaps a login from a slightly different network node than usual, a transaction formatted differently than standard, or a pattern of activity coinciding with local events. These were anomalies he didn't notice, but the analysts cataloged them meticulously. Each anomaly became a clue pointing toward his identity, schedule, and habits. It was the beginning of the net tightening. Field operatives, now working with Nigerian authorities, began discreet reconnaissance. They observed the areas connected to the digital traces, noted the behavior of residents, and identified potential points of contact. Each observation was conducted quietly, ensuring that Phantom would remain unaware. The challenge was immense. He was cautious, disciplined, and deeply familiar with digital surveillance techniques. He had avoided detection for years, and every move now had to be deliberate to avoid spooking him. For the first time, Phantom's world, the glowing screens, the servers, the carefully constructed empire of shell companies, was not completely hidden. Somewhere far away, a team of experts was studying his routines, habits, and digital signatures, using technology and strategy to pinpoint his presence in the real world. And yet, for him, everything appeared normal. Confidence, the constant companion of his criminal life, had never wavered. Each day he operated as he always had, unaware that the first small mistake, the misconfigured email, had become the starting point for his eventual exposure. The lead did not make him immediately vulnerable. There was still work to be done. They did not yet know his name. They did not know his exact address, but they had enough to focus their efforts, to begin targeting the network of accounts, shell companies, and collaborators that formed his empire. For the FBI, it was a moment of quiet triumph. Years of analysis, observation, and patience were finally yielding tangible results. For Phantom, it was just another night of flawless operation, unaware that the first cracks in his digital fortress had begun to appear, and that the world he had manipulated for years was quietly closing in on him. The first lead had been found. And from that lead, the investigation would only grow stronger, moving inexorably toward the day when the invisible shadow would be forced into the light. The first lead had given the FBI a starting point, but it was only the beginning. Months of meticulous investigation had narrowed Phantom's operations to a particular city in Nigeria, but the team knew the critical challenge remained: identifying the man behind the digital empire and locating his residence without alerting him. Any mistake could send him underground permanently. The analysts worked night and day, cross-referencing multiple sources of data. Email headers, transaction times, IP routing, and even subtle formatting patterns were compared to local internet infrastructure. Patterns emerged. Certain logins occurred during predictable hours, suggesting his daily routine. Transactions that spanned multiple shell companies revealed sequences that reflected human behavior rather than purely algorithmic execution. Each detail, seemingly minor, formed a behavioral signature. For the first time, the FBI began building a psychological profile of Phantom. He was patient, disciplined, and methodical, a master of invisibility in both digital and real worlds. His operations were sophisticated enough to evade detection for years, but his humanity left patterns behind. The team studied them closely. They hypothesized his approximate age, likely level of education, and even potential habits. They were still thousands of miles away, but for the first time, they were close enough to predict his movements. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, Phantom lived in the rhythm of his own design. He woke, ate, worked, and slept according to the schedule he had perfected over years. His empire ran without interruption, and every collaborator performed their role with precision. He had no reason to suspect that the carefully maintained facade of invisibility was beginning to crumble. Confidence had always been his ally, and he leaned on it now more than ever. The breakthrough came with financial analysis. Investigators traced patterns of funds transfers routed through Nigerian banks. Even with multiple intermediaries, subtle timing patterns and minor errors revealed potential accounts linked to him personally. These accounts were connected not to shell companies, but to small personal expenditures, a local purchase here, a minor payment there. Individually, each transaction was insignificant, but together they narrowed the search to a small geographic area within the city. At the same time, the FBI coordinated with Nigerian authorities discreetly. The local law enforcement team was briefed on general patterns without revealing sensitive details that could alert Phantom. Surveillance teams began observing the area, mapping neighborhoods and noting movement patterns, infrastructure, and possible points of access. Their goal was precision: identify the target without tipping him off. Inside his home, Phantom continued working late into the night. Screens glowed, servers hummed, and millions of dollars moved silently through virtual channels. He occasionally communicated with collaborators, issuing instructions with the efficiency and confidence that had defined his operations for years. Yet unknown to him, the threads of the investigation were slowly tightening around his daily routine. Analysts had also begun monitoring his collaborators, some of whom had left subtle traces. Phone numbers, email responses, and even behavioral patterns from secondary participants provided additional data points. These seemingly minor details gave the FBI a clearer picture of Phantom's environment, including likely residential zones, commuting patterns, and potential digital vulnerabilities. Every night, the analysts ran simulations. If Phantom logged in at certain times, what was his likely location? If a transaction followed a specific sequence, which neighborhood might it originate from? Each simulation reduced uncertainty, gradually converting assumptions into actionable intelligence. Meanwhile, Phantom's confidence began to show cracks, not because he suspected investigation, but because the complexity of his operations was growing. Managing multiple shell companies, coordinating dozens of collaborators, and ensuring that each transaction appeared legitimate required constant attention. Minor lapses were almost inevitable. And indeed, one such minor lapse would soon provide the FBI with a critical confirmation: a login from an unrotated IP originating from a building within the neighborhood under surveillance. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but analysts recognized the significance immediately. Their simulations had predicted this exact scenario weeks in advance, and now reality matched the model. Field teams prepared for targeted observation. Nigerian authorities were briefed on security protocols, while FBI operatives coordinated remotely to ensure the operation remained covert. Every detail was double-checked: access points, potential escape routes, local traffic patterns, and the possibility of intervention from the hackers' collaborators. The goal was simple but critical: confirm the target without tipping him off. Phantom, still oblivious, continued to live as he had for years. His empire remained functional, his collaborators executed instructions flawlessly, and every night screens glowed quietly as the intricate web of his operations continued to spin. But the invisible threads of surveillance were now wrapped around him. The first observation confirmed suspicions. The man behind the digital empire was physically present in a specific building in the predicted area. The FBI had narrowed the target from a city of millions to a single block, a single building, and within days they would be able to identify him definitively. The net had tightened further. Phantom's invisibility, built over years of skill, precision, and discipline, was no longer absolute. One small error, a misconfigured email header, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this point. And while he remained unaware, the world outside was preparing for the moment when the ghost would finally be forced into the light. For the first time, Phantom's empire had a real-world vulnerability, and the countdown to exposure had begun.
By the time the surveillance team arrived in the neighborhood, everything had been meticulously prepared. Months of digital investigation, geographic analysis, and collaboration with Nigerian authorities had narrowed Phantom's operations to a single building. Now, for the first time, the FBI could see him in the real world. Field operatives set up discrete observation points. Unmarked vehicles were stationed at strategic locations around the building, and operatives positioned themselves in nearby shops and streets, blending in with daily life. Their mission was simple yet delicate: confirm the target's presence, observe routines, and gather actionable intelligence, all without alerting the hacker or any of his collaborators. Inside the building, Phantom continued his nightly routine. The glow of multiple computer screens illuminated his face as he coordinated transactions, monitored accounts, and communicated with collaborators. Years of practice had made his movements predictable, methodical, and almost ritualistic. Each click, each command, each transfer had been repeated countless times, until now, completely oblivious to the eyes quietly watching from outside. For the operatives, the moment was both tense and exhilarating. They had been tracing Phantom's shadow for months, through emails, transactions, misconfigured headers, and digital anomalies. And now, for the first time, the abstract figure had a physical form, a face, a presence in the real world. The ghost they had been hunting for so long was finally visible. The surveillance team carefully documented everything. Patterns of movement within the building were noted: when lights came on, when screens were activated, when Phantom left his workspace. Even the timings of breaks, meals, and conversations was logged. Each detail, however mundane, was critical. It allowed the FBI to predict behavior, identify vulnerabilities, and plan the next steps. Phantom remained unaware. Confidence had been his constant companion for years, and it remained unshakable. His empire continued to function flawlessly. Millions of dollars moved silently across continents. Collaborators executed instructions without error, and every night he believed himself untouchable. Yet the first observation revealed a vulnerability that even he could not anticipate. While his digital footprint was nearly invisible, his physical presence was predictable. Every routine, every habit, every subtle pattern in his movements created opportunities for law enforcement to intervene at the right moment. The operatives noted the building's security, locks, entrances, exits, and potential escape routes. They observed the comings and goings of neighbors and collaborators. Every detail contributed to a growing map of Phantom's worlds beyond the screen, a world he had long believed was secure and invisible. Analysts in the U.S. continued to monitor his digital operations remotely. They synchronized observations with field teams, noting when specific logins occurred, when transfers were initiated, and how these actions aligned with his physical presence. It was a perfect combination of cyber and real-world surveillance.
For Phantom, the night was ordinary. He worked, monitored, and executed transactions as usual. He occasionally communicated with collaborators, issuing instructions with the same confidence and precision that had defined his career. He had no awareness that every move he made, every routine he followed, was being recorded, analyzed, and used to construct a precise operational map. The observation also revealed something unexpected: subtle inconsistencies in his physical environment. Equipment placement, cable routing, and even personal habits left traces that could be exploited. While he had avoided detection digitally, the real world offered vulnerabilities he had not accounted for. This marked the first time the FBI had visual confirmation of Phantom. It was a crucial turning point. Up until now, the investigation had relied entirely on digital traces, financial anomalies, and predictive modeling. Now, they could connect these abstract data points to a living, breathing individual, a man who had eluded capture for years with skill, patience, and confidence. The observation continued for nights. Every routine, every movement, every interaction was logged and analyzed. The team watched as Phantom navigated his world, confident, meticulous, and unaware that the first tangible threads of exposure were now surrounding him. And while he believed himself untouchable, the reality was starkly different. The careful patience of investigators, combined with the precision of digital forensics, had placed him firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement. The first observation was only the beginning. It confirmed everything the FBI had suspected. Phantom was real, present, and vulnerable. And with this knowledge, the team could now plan the final steps, a coordinated operation that would bring years of investigation, patience, and meticulous tracking to a climax. For the first time, the ghost had a physical form. For the first time, the long con was within reach of justice. And for Phantom, the life he had meticulously crafted, an empire of invisibility, wealth, and control, was on the brink of exposure. The hunt was no longer theoretical. The ghost had been seen, and soon the shadow would be confronted. With visual confirmation of Phantom in hand, the FBI and Nigerian authorities began coordinating the final operation. Months of investigation, digital tracing, and surveillance had brought them to this critical point. They knew that Phantom's empire had thrived for years because of his skill, patience, and careful planning. To apprehend him, they needed to match his level of precision. The planning phase was meticulous. Teams worked around the clock, reviewing every piece of intelligence gathered during months of surveillance. Analysts provided detailed reports on his routines, collaborators, and physical environment. Every login timestamp, every transaction, every observed habit became part of the operational blueprint. The objective was simple but high stakes: arrest Phantom without alerting him or his collaborators, ensuring the operation proceeded smoothly while preserving the integrity of ongoing investigations into his international fraud network. Any misstep could allow him to disappear, erase digital traces, or destroy evidence. Investigators divided responsibilities clearly. The FBI handled digital monitoring, predictive analysis, and coordination with U.S. authorities, while Nigerian law enforcement would execute the on-ground operation. Surveillance teams monitored every movement in the neighborhood, ensuring they understood his daily routines and possible escape routes. They observed the building's layout, entrances, exits, stairwells, and even small details like window locks and service doors. Nothing was left to chance. Meanwhile, Phantom remained completely unaware. He followed his routine as usual, executing transactions, coordinating with collaborators, and maintaining the appearance of invisibility that had protected him for years. Confidence, the cornerstone of his operations, remained unshakable. His empire continued to function flawlessly. Millions of dollars moved silently across continents. Collaborators executed instructions without error, and every night he believed himself untouchable. Investigators knew the end was coming when a single misconfigured email header revealed what years of caution had hidden. That tiny mistake became the thread that unraveled everything. Digital trails crossed borders, passed through shell companies and hidden accounts, and narrowed to one location in Nigeria. Quiet coordination between the FBI and Nigerian authorities followed. Surveillance was set. Communications were monitored. There would be no warning. Unaware, Phantom kept working. Every login, every transfer, every move was now being watched. The confidence that had protected him for years had turned into complacency. On the night of the operation, the city was calm. Surveillance teams took their positions while Phantom worked behind glowing screens, convinced he was still invisible. When agents moved in, the arrest took seconds. His devices were seized. The digital empire went dark. Extradition took months. Evidence was cataloged, accounts dismantled, and the full scope of the fraud laid bare. Under heavy guard, Phantom was flown to the United States. In court, prosecutors presented years of digital records and financial trails. The mistake that exposed him was laid out in detail. The moment everything began to collapse. The man who believed he was untouchable was now fully visible. The ghost had been caught.